Good morning, good afternoon, I should say. Good afternoon, everybody, and welcome to Lunch Break with the Rabbi. Good to see you all here again today. And today we're going to continue on our subjects and discussing different concepts and ideas in Judaism, why, what, where, and how. As we've mentioned in the past, if anybody has any other questions that they would like us to discuss, feel free to email me or text me or whatever it was, any type of way that you'd like to contact me, and we can try to cover that issue as well. Today, we're going to continue in our discussion. Yesterday, we discussed about the Holy Temple or the concepts of the land of Israel. Today, we continue with some practices that were done in the Holy Temple that are found many cases and many times and many places in the Torah, which that is the concept of sacrifices, animal sacrifices. And many people from all walks of life and from all different types of varieties are perturbed by the fact that the Torah calls for animal sacrifices. The whole book of Leviticus talks about animal sacrifices. The book of Exodus, when it talks about the Paschal offering, is an animal sacrifice. The book of Numbers, just last week's Torah reading, we discussed the difference between different sacrifices that were brought every single day, sacrifices that were brought on Shabbat, sacrifices that were brought on special holidays, depending on the holiday, how many extra sacrifices. And in fact, if we look even a little deeper into the concept of sacrifices, the sacrifice itself, God calls Reyach Nechoyach, gives God a pleasure. So what is it about the sacrifices? Why is it that God says he enjoys sacrifices so much? What is it about the sacrifices? And over here, we take a little deeper look in today into looking at the concept of why Judaism and why the Torah calls for animal sacrifices. So number one, today we can no longer bring any animal sacrifices. Reason being is animal sacrifices were only allowed in the Holy Temple, in Jerusalem, on the altar, slaughtered and done properly as it was done in the Holy Temple. That's number one. Number two, it's not like many think that there was a waste, that the animal was just burnt on the altar, burnt alive. No, the animal sacrifices in the time of the temple were not burnt alive. They were first slaughtered according to the rituals as we would today slaughter according to Jewish law. Only afterwards was it then placed on the Holy Temple, on the altar, with the fire being consuming it and burning it. And even when it was placed on the altar, again, it was a very big animal, so it had to be cut into pieces. So it was not burning an animal alive, how some people think mistaken. Still in all, some want to know why the need for sacrifices. Why does God want so many animals? What is the concept of sacrifices behind it? They say a story about the Baal Shem Tov. The Baal Shem Tov, before he was known and renowned to be the Baal Shem Tov, a great scholar and mystic, he went around as very undercover, so to speak. And one of his undercover practices was that he was a shochet, a ritual slaughterer. And he was a ritual slaughterer in a town where all the people of the town would bring to him his different animals. And when he left, another ritual slaughterer, shochet, came and took his place. And when that fellow came, as it's customary before a shochet slaughters an animal, they have to first rinse the blade to make sure there's no niches in it, to make sure it's kosher. And he was rinsing it, and the non-Jew there that was helping him says, "Why do you rinse it with water?" The Yisraelik, referring to the Baal Shem Tov, who was the ritual slaughterer before him, would rinse his knife with tears. Meaning that though that he would have to slaughter the animal, it was painful for him, the very fact that he had to kill an animal. The question is, what is the reason still that we, as Jewish people and as the Torah, allows for sacrifices, and what's the reason why sacrifices were done? So though we find in the actual sacrifice, most of the sacrifices that were brought in the Holy Temple, majority of the animal was given to the Kohen or to the Kohen's family, the people at the time. Majority of the animal was eaten. Only certain unedible parts were then burnt on the altar. Still in all, the question remains, as we mentioned, animal sacrifices sounds primitive, sounds cruel, sounds pointless. What was the reason why God would ask of the Jewish people to bring sacrifices? So there are many different types of reasons why people are against sacrifices, or if you take people that are vegetarians, because since they believe we shouldn't touch animals and allow them to roam, we're not going to address that issue today. What we are going to address is a concept which is mentioned in the book of Genesis, when God created the human being and every other species in the world. God said the following in the book of Genesis. He says, God blessed Adam and Eve. God said to them, be fruitful and multiply, fill the earth and subdue it. Rule over the fish in the sea, over the fowl of the sky, and over all the beasts that tread upon the earth. From the moment that God created the human being and all other species in the world, God gave dominionship to the human being that they have the right to utilize anything and everything in this world. Of course, not in a way of torturing, as we know those are one of the seven universal Noahide laws, that we are not allowed to torture an animal in any way, shape, or form. However, we are allowed to utilize the animal for our benefit. And for that reason, we are allowed to use the animal to work for us, as they did in times of old, where the animal plowed, the animal threshed, the animal would schlep their stuff. And as well as we can use an animal, if necessary, if we'd like, to slaughter the animal with the least amount of pain possible, and to keep that animal, that we should be able to have that dominionship over the animal. Meaning that the mission that was given to the human right wasn't just a right that we have the ability to have a dominionship over the animal. The mission that was given to the human beings was that they should subdue everything that exists in this world. Anything physical and materialistic must be subdued. What does it mean to be subdued? Subdue means that everything in this world, regardless of whether it's cognizant of it or not, has a physical, materialistic being to it, as well as a spiritual being to it. The body and soul exists within everything in the universe. Subdue means to be able to negate or to put down or to not allow to fester the materialism, but bring out the spirituality within everything that's there. There's a spiritual concealment that exists within everything of creation. And because of this, we have a job to reveal the concealment which is in everything. To give you an example, it is brought in many Hasidic explanations, or a story actually told between a story of the previous Lubavitcher Rebbe and his father that were once taking a walk. And his father explained to his son that everything that exists in this world manifests godliness. Even the smallest blade of grass manifests the greatness of godliness. And while they were talking, the previous Rebbe was then a youngster at the time, took a piece of grass, while he was walking, took a little branch or a little blade of leaf that was on a tree, and he took it off and he started playing with it, to keep himself busy. And his father reprimanded him and he said, didn't I just tell you everything has a spiritual energy? What are you just being wasteful to it? What was he saying over here was that everything in this world has a mandate and has a mission that has to be utilized for the spiritual environment that it contains. And we as human beings were charged with the mission at the creation of the world that we should subdue all those physical creatures and bring it to its spiritual modification. That includes grass, stone, inanimate vegetation, living things as well, including animals. So by us eating animals, or by the animals being brought as a sacrifice, in essence, what we're doing is following the mandate that God has given us to subdue it, to bring about its proper spiritual revelation, which is hidden within it. Which this takes it even a step further than even most vegetarians, which only are concerned about animals. We are concerned about everything. For example, there's a very famous saying, the Hasidic dictum, which is that when you walk on the street and you don't utter words of Torah, the street itself says, what gives you the right to walk on me? How are you any better than me if you're not using it for a spiritual manifestation and for spiritual uplifting? So what we see over here is, therefore, when we come over here to a person and coming to the concept of animals, many people, whether they eat meat or not, believe that it's okay for human beings to take animal life. Most people or vegetarians that are against animals eating meat is because maybe the treatment that they don't do to animals, which of course, according to Jewish law, animals have to be treated with respect, dignity, to the extent that we find many times in the Talmud, where it brings about stories of great sages who even roaches or mice that they weren't treating nicely, and because of that they were punished or whatever it may be. The concept is that we have to treat animals respectfully, but at the same time be cognizant of what their mission is, that they have a mission to also reveal their spirituality, and who is the one that brings about reveals their mission. That is the Jew who utilizes it for a godly purpose. What can be a greater godly purpose than bringing it as a sacrifice or slaughtering it and using it for a godly purpose, for a Shabbos meal and making a blessing on it and slaughtering it according to Jewish law? And that's why you can even look today in many different books and many different discussions that talk about animal cruelty. The most humane way that one can actually eat something is through slaughtering an animal. That is the most humane way that you can actually kill the animal. So when we talk about over here, the concept of sacrifices, there were many other explanations that were given as well. The interesting thing that we find is Maimonides, when he talks about these sacrifices as well, in one of his books, when he talks about rationales, when he he gives an explanation saying that was be able because Jews at the time were so used to pagan practices, so this was, so to speak, a concession for them. However, Maimonides, and when it comes to his laws, he says that the sacrifices are one of those laws which there are no rationale to it, and it was something that God commanded the Jewish people. However, as we know that in every single mitzvah, there's different layers of the mitzvah. There's the simple understanding of it, there's the deeper understanding of it, there's the mystical understanding of it. But we went all the way to the mystical, and now we're going to go peel back a layer, which is the concept of animals also teaches us another concept, which is sacrifices. The word sacrifice in Hebrew also comes from korban, to become close. Many of the reasons why people had to bring sacrifices were because either a sin offering, and then there were communal sacrifices, which were also atoning for different sins. The concept of the sacrifices were that when a person does a certain type of action, it ultimately causes them to bring an emotion. Meaning, if a person was to just contemplate about what they did wrong, today they did it and tomorrow they'll do it again. But if there's a repercussion, if there's something they need to do because of it, they are more cognizant of what they've done wrong. What the Torah has done was attach every sin that a person did with a certain action that can be translated and motivate the person to have a different emotion. So the sacrifices are there, which symbolize the animal is the animal being which caused the person to sin. He then takes that animal and slaughters it and gives it to God, being cognizant that what his mistake was, he detached himself, so to speak, from godliness through taking the animal and bringing it as a sacrifice. He then takes his animal within himself, bringing it as a sacrifice. As I mentioned before, the word korban in Hebrew, which means sacrifice, can also mean closeness. He then becomes closer to God because of it. So the drastic action of the sacrifice is effective to make the person and give them that emotional impression and emotional transition from being and acting in a way which was against their relationship with God to be able to develop and cultivate the relationship of God by slaughtering their animal instinct and by coming closer from a spiritual conscious method. Number three, the third and final reason what the concept behind sacrifices is that God, in his infinite wisdom, created all different kinds of species. And he created different levels from inanimate to vegetation, to living beings, and to humans. And each one of us depends on a lower level. For example, the vegetation depends on the inanimate, and the living being, the animals depend on vegetation and inanimate, and us as human beings depend on animals, vegetation, and earth, stone, inanimate things. What over here God was saying that every single level, it's not a question of dependency, but it's a question of uplifting, a question of changing and transformation. The same way the vegetation transforms the soil to making it something productive, so too the animal makes the vegetation to something productive because now it can support and the animal can live on it. So too the human being becomes productive by utilizing and changing the animal, the vegetation, and the soil, utilizing them all for the godly purpose and intent of why they were created. And that's exactly, who knows why they were created, is the creator himself, which is God. And God tells us, as we mentioned, charge us in the beginning of creation, that we have an obligation to uplift and to transform the world. Therefore, when we see all the different things in the world, for example, when a person gives charity, he is uplifting the coins, making them a spiritual conduit for godliness in this world. So anything we do with a physical thing or any matter that we use, for example, when we use wool for tzitzit, we are taking the wool and uplifting it and making it a spiritual conduit. Same as with leather, same as with any item of a physical being, when we use it for a godly purpose, we're uplifting it. The same as well as when it comes to animals. When they are used for sacrifices, or for godly reasons, done in a godly way, done in a Torah way, they are then uplifted and utilized for their ultimate purpose of why God created them. So what we have over here is, what God asked of us is that ultimately God does not want from us sacrifices today, because since we don't have the holy temple. But what God does want from us today is that the same way that we came close to God through bringing sacrifices, symbolically of dedicating our evil inclination and just transforming it, so too today we have to take those evil impulses, those negative impulses, and transform them into positive impulses and bringing us closer to God. So to summarize, there are three reasons of why sacrifices are so spoken about in the temple and why the Torah talks so much about sacrifices. Number one, the reason is because the right to utilize God's creations, including animal life, is contingent on the fact that we're fulfilling the divine mission that God has given us to subdue and sublimate the material world for godly purposes. Number two, reason is because action fuels emotion. The intense act of the animal sacrifice was intended to stimulate the individual to an emotional realization of the harmfulness and the transgression of what the individual did, and the excessive bodily pursuits that awaken our drive for better meaning and devotion to goodness and godliness. And number three, by using the animal for a holy purpose, we then elevate the animal life to a greater elevated state than if it was just being a plain, simple animal. Thank you for tuning in and joining us today with Lunch Break with the Rabbi. Hope to see you again tomorrow at 1 p.m. God bless you and have a wonderful day.